and metaphors without really thinking often about what they mean. What does it mean to work smarter, not harder? Where does that smarter ever get defined? Einstein once said, imagination is more important than knowledge. This is Einstein, arguably the greatest thinker of the 20th century. Imagination, and more important than knowledge. He once said the only really valuable thing is intuition. How often in our conversations about innovation do either of those terms ever come up? Innovation is a term often confused with creativity. You know, there's usually not very careful definitions of innovation, but here it is. Innovation is when you take two contradictory, even opposing, contrasting ideas and reconcile them somehow and come up with something new. Many people define innovation as something new. Well, that's not good enough. You know, innovation is the product of careful thinking and thought experiments that then produce something that was unexpected and that was completely unknown. You know, this is what Galileo did. You know, in reconciling what in his era was understood as the physics of local earthbound phenomena versus astronomy. You know, this is what Einstein did, and scientists like Galileo and like Einstein and like Heisenberg and like so many others that actually documented their thinking really communicate the nature of the thought experiments that gave rise to choosing the right antagonistic ideas. You know, you don't go to an antagonistic ideas dictionary to find those things. Those things arise from the passion of an individual who is determined and persistent about resolving it somehow. And that's the nature of innovation. Suppose you took, for example, in terms of products, a laptop and decided that you wanted to create a different digital appliance, and here's the contradiction, that had less features, you know, and more usability. You know, there's a contradiction. Less features, less functionality, and more usability. I'd say pretty much in the history of information technology, that particular intense contradiction hasn't been as carefully considered in order to create something new as when somebody, and you know the product I'm talking about, ripped the keyboard off the laptop, took out the USB ports, reduced functionality, and came up with something that's infinitely and extraordinarily more usable. You know, that's the nature of innovation. And that is the first part of the scientific process. And the problem with our understanding of the scientific process is that we look at the tail end of it. We look at the assembly line part of it. We look only and value. We value and speak to the part of it that is observable and measurable. But where does it come from? It comes from thinking. It comes from thought. And it comes from the emotion and the drives that push that thought. You know, when we talk about scientific method, who talks about thought experiments? Who talks about where the antagonistic principles or ideas came from in the first place? Who talks about imagination? Who talks about intuition? No, we talk about test, retest. We talk about taking a hypothesis and testing it and retesting it and measuring the results and see if they are predictable. You know, that's solely it. But there's a question of what you value in terms of thinking here. In one of the foreign countries I worked in, I taught a course in research and development to very senior IT executives, and I asked them, there were about 27 in the room, and I asked them, define the scientific method. Every single person in the room defined it as the linearity of the tail end of the scientific method, of what is observable, actionable, and measurable. Well, where do the ideas of doing them in the first place and the hypothesis that creates the whole purpose of the methodology, where does that come from? That's what nonlinearity consists of. Nonlinearity is where the ideas and the innovation source. Okay. Another element in the history of Western thought that really cemented our linear thinking was the printing press. In two regards. One is the printing press was the first assembly line, but also because the printed word means sequence, linearity, and fragmentation of our thinking. Our thinking is fragmented, has to be categorized. Look at what's done with knowledge management these days. Besides the fact that, as you'll see later, people don't really understand what knowledge is. In addition, these systems get more and more fragmented, more categorized, and more convoluted because there is so much that is nonlinear knowledge and information that's left out. People don't even know what it is. And you cannot know what knowledge is if you don't understand the nonlinearity of it. Where was I? The printing press. That written, sequential language is so ingrained into our thinking that there's people that think that you can't think without language. Einstein once said, words and language do not form any part of the mechanics of my thinking. There are other aspects to assembly line thinking, and assembly line, granted, is an industrial age term. The term we would use in the information age is project thinking. In the modern corporation, everything is a project. Strategy becomes a project. Change management becomes a project. Everything gets on the linear assembly line of project thinking. The fragmented, sequential, highly controlled assembly line. And you probably know that most projects, certainly most software projects, fail. Don't meet deadlines, don't meet the outcomes that were expected, don't meet the time frames. As a consultant, on a number of occasions I've been asked to do what's called a post-mortem, on the dead body of the project. And so you go into a room and you have the senior executives present and you have the core team present. And if the executives take some level of ownership over what happened and the environment is safe enough, what happens invariably is that people start to recognize that they knew. They knew. They knew what the problems were and they knew what was happening. But it didn't fit into the linear way of thinking about the project or the very linearly defined culture that makes it acceptable to say certain things but not to talk about intuition or feeling something or imagining something or the kind of abstraction of a sense of something going wrong. We don't have a language for that. So what happens in these sessions is that people kind of rediscover, since their awareness at the time wasn't conscious, and since we don't give value to that kind of thinking, and since we don't make it systematic, we don't have processes for it, we don't define it even, then what happens is people in these sessions remember that they knew, which is really extraordinary. They sit and go, well, there was this time when I realized that, something was screwy here. But people aren't going to talk about it, and they aren't going to take the risk to say it. But what amazes me constantly is that the nonlinear information that created the crisis is something that, at some level of awareness, and definitely not usually conscious awareness, people knew. Had they known that kind of thinking, then the crisis would most likely have been handled in some way. Let's see. I think the thing I want to end this conversation about linear versus nonlinear thinking on is that linear thinking is a horrendous way of living because you can't keep up. You are missing so much of what reality is. And that reality isn't just external reality, it's the awareness and knowledge of the reality inside of yourself that you're actively suppressing without being aware that you're suppressing it. The losses are enormous, but we have no sense of the losses. The potential gains are infinite, but we have no sense of what those potential gains are. So what I'm going to do in the next videos is go into exactly what I mean by knowledge and define it in a way that you have not heard before, and go into what post-industrial learning should be like, because our learning is entirely defined by the assembly line and linearity and fragmentation. You can't go into Engineering 103 if you hadn't had Engineering 102 or 101. It's the asking employees to walk into a room and have someone in front of them who assumes they know more than the employee saying, turn to page 33 please and fill out the questionnaire, you have 10 minutes. This is insanity in the 21st century. And thank you. I will go in that direction next.